My name is Keith Beavers, and to give you a sense of what it's like to be a Capricorn, when you burn the roof of your mouth, it's your entire identity until it heals. Ouch. Ouch. Today we are going to talk about Caymus. If you don't know, it is one of the most popular wines in American wine culture. It has a very unique story that will make you quite dizzy, for I too was quite dizzy while researching. I feel like all these pages have so much awesome information in them, but it's so intense. Get ready. There are two things to understand about Caymus before we really grasp what it is today. First, we have to kind of get our brains around the concept of the Native American culture of the Napa Valley due to the name of the wine. And then we have to look at the people that came to the Napa Valley from the east to settle on wagon trains. These two things are a very important part of American wine history and American history in general, but these two things come together to explain Caymus. Before people from Europe came to California, specifically the Spanish, there, especially in Northern California, was a thriving indigenous community of humans. There were three tribal groups or communities that we're going to talk about. The large group was the Pomo, P-O-M-O. If you look at a county map of California and you go to the north, you'll see Mendocino County, you'll see Lake County, you'll see Sonoma County, and then you'll see Napa Valley. Those four quadrants were basically the territory of what are called the Pomo people, a large indigenous community in Northern California. Now, understanding these communities can be a little bit confusing at times because there's a lot of intersections with the cultures within the community. There was another native community called the Wintu around Sacramento who were influenced and intersected with the Pomo. Okay, and that's a language bridge. The Pomo were at one time invaded by a tribe called the Yuki people. And the Yuki people were a large group of tribes that ended up coming into the Pomo territory and taking over a small section of that area, kind of the northern part north around the Mendocino area. The thing is, the Pomo, or their language, was influenced by the Wintu. So the name of the Yuki people is Wintu for foreigner or enemy, because they kind of came in and took over that one spot. So the Yuki people had three groups. You had the Valley people, or I'm going to try to pronounce this, Ukomnum. You had the people outside the valley. I believe they were called Huchnum or Huchnum. And then you had the people of the coast, or Yucatan Tilka. I think that's how you pronounce it. The southern border of their territory, the Yuki people, was around Mount Hood in Sonoma County. Now, 500 years ago, a faction from the Yuki people separated and moved into the Napa Valley. These would become known as the Wapo. The Wapo people, well, the Wapo name is actually a name given to these people. Their actual name, from what I've read, is Onasatis, O-N-A-S-A-T-I-S. I think that's how you pronounce it. But the Wapo people moved into the Napa Valley and lived happily there. The thing is about these people is, I don't know what happened with the Yuki tribes for them to leave, but they lived in the Napa Valley without any central power. They didn't have an authority, meaning they didn't really have a fundamental political system, even just like one person leading everybody. They were just hunters and gatherers living in the valley. And their language was very much influenced by the Pomo language. So you can kind of see how all of these peoples are kind of intersecting with each other. The Wapo, or Onasatis, their territory was pretty large. The northern part of their territory was the south shore of Clear Lake. They had villages in what is St. Helena today. They had villages in what is Geyserville today. They had villages around Calistoga. And of course, down south, they had villages near where Yountville is today. And a little village there. Put a pin in that. So this is a snapshot of what was going on with the indigenous people of the Napa Valley at this point. In 1823, the Spanish arrive, a conquistador and a priest, a Jesuit priest. Their goal was to settle this land and convert all the native people into their religion by building a mission. Now, the Wapo people at this moment, actually, the population estimates around 1,700 humans in the Wapo nation. These people did not want to go anywhere, obviously. They had no centralized government, but they were happy being hunters and gatherers, and they resisted heavily. And they began to clash with the Spanish trying to take over this particular land. And the Spanish had a word, guapo. It means other things like handsome, I think, but it also means brave. And this is where the word Wapo comes from. The Wapo people became known as the Wapo people because of the word guapo, inherited or influenced by the Spanish. And they were called Wapo or brave because of their resistance to the Spanish settlement on their land. If you've listened to Wine 101's American wine history story, this part is going to sound pretty familiar. In 1833, Mexico sends Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo to Northern California to engage with the native people there, the Wapo people. As Vallejo is engaging with the Wapo people, a man by the name of George C. Yount, an immigrant from the United States, is actually in what is called Alta California, working his way up to the Napa Valley from being a fur trapper down near Los Angeles. He arrives in the Napa Valley in 1834. Now, this is just all very interesting. So there's this conflict going on with the native people. Vallejo has a lot of influence in this area. He's kind of the big figure. There's also a governor, Gutierrez, which we'll talk about in a second. But Vallejo has command of this area. And when George C. Yount shows up, he's an immigrant and he's just looking for work. And Vallejo really liked employing immigrants because they were cheap labor. So George C. Yount becomes a carpenter for Vallejo. By 1836, Vallejo convinces the Wapo people to sign a peace treaty. Now, this is a big mix of stuff going on right now. We have Vallejo is a big presence in the area. His worker, his employee is George C. Yount. They become really good friends. And the Wapo people end up either being dispersed or being converted into the Spanish religion and then being dispersed through the missions. So with the Wapo people pretty much no longer in the valley because the population actually goes down to about 50 and then it gets smaller and smaller than that. In 1828, actually, smallpox hit the community. So I'm sure that was a factor in it. But the Wapo presence does kind of disappear. So Vallejo has all this land. In 1836, he grants his employee and friend, George C. Yount, a large swath of land in the Napa Valley. This is where Yountville is today. But the town was built within this large piece of land. He was granted 11,887 acres. That's a lot of land. The land was granted to George C. Yount by Governor Gutierrez through the influence of Vallejo. So it had to go through a political process. And the sort of legislative name for this was called Rancho Caymus Grant. Now, Caymus was spelled C-A-Y-M-U-S. But if you look at a map of the Wapo Nation, you'll see that where Yountville is today and where the Caymus Ranch initially was, surrounds one of the old Wapo villages. And on that map, you'll see K-A-I-M-U-S. This is where the word Caymus comes from. This would eventually be the Napa Valley AVA, and within it would be several other sub-AVAs. This is way in the future, but I guess I'm saying this because in 1864, a man by the name of Thomas Rutherford marries George C. Yount's granddaughter, Elizabeth Yount, and as a gift to the newlywed couple, George C. Yount gifts them over 1,000 acres of land within Rancho Caymus. That would later become Rutherford, the town, today of only, I think, 115 people, but one of the sub-AVAs of Napa Valley. Put a pin in that. It's also a cool foreshadowing of Rutherford eventually becoming an AVA because Thomas Rutherford planted vines there. He actually, I think 10 acres, and he was known in the area for a quality wine producer back in the day before Prohibition. I think California would have been a lot different if Prohibition didn't happen. Okay, so now we know where the word Caymus comes from. We now know where Rutherford is and how Rutherford became Rutherford. This is very important in understanding the wine Caymus, because now we have to talk about the Wagner family, but not just the Wagner family, but the Gloss family and the Steese family. We also have to understand that within this family, there are multiple people named Charlie, Charles, and Chuck, and it can be a little dizzying. So bear with me. I had to write down the actual family tree to understand it. Let's go. In the late 19th century, around 1880, Charles and Mary Gloss emigrate from Germany, the Pfalz region, to San Francisco. I don't know if they fell in love in Germany on the way or in San Francisco, but it's in San Francisco they actually get married and start having a family. They end up taking their family to the Napa Valley, and they become homesteaders on Howell Mountain, literally building like roads and houses and infrastructure. They also planted 14 acres of vineyards on Howell Mountain, now a very coveted part of the Napa Valley for wine. I'm not really sure what they planted, but they were from Germany and Riesling was around, so maybe Riesling? In 1906, a man by the name of Carl Wagner and his wife Catherine emigrate from Alsace, France, to the United States. In 1910, Charles and Mary Gloss's son, Charlie, marries Mabel Steese. They move down to the Napa River and settle between Oakville and Rutherford and have a family. They end up having 7 children, and their 4th child's name was Lorna Bell Gloss. Lorna was born in 1915, and her mom's side of the family have a really kind of deep root in the American experience, where the Steese family came from Bible Grove, Missouri to California on a wagon train, and their father was the captain of, I think, a 40 wagon train expedition to the West. What's interesting about Bible Grove, Missouri, and it being close to the Mount Pleasant Township, that's where the first AVA in the United States was created. The second one was in Napa, so it's kind of back and forth here. It's kind of cool. These families settled in the Oak Knoll district of Napa Valley, and interestingly enough, Lorna's grandfather was one of the first winemakers in the family, making wine for the Shea Brothers, Chaix, which is now the Ladera Winery. He also co-operated Inglenook after the original owner, Gustav Nienbaum, the captain, passed away. And in 1900, he was actually working for George Latour at Below Vineyards. I mean, this guy was like really deep into this history of American wine. Just checking in. How we doing? A lot of information? I know. It's going to get crazier. The Wagners are in Rutherford, and they, being from Europe and having winemaking skills from Alsace, they set up their own wine company called the Wagner Wine Company. And they would go on to be extremely successful in the bulk wine market. It says they produced about 30,000 gallons of wine in the first few years of their business. It's a lot of wine. Carl and Catherine have 5 kids. And in 1912, their son, Charlie Wagner, is born in Rutherford. Lorna Bell Gloss and Charlie Wagner grow up a mile from each other. They go to the same high school. They become high school sweethearts. And in 1934, in a mad flex, elope in Reno, Nevada. Yes. In 1941, the couple buys 73 acres of land really close to the Wagner home ranch and plant 10 acres of vineyards. I'm not really sure what they planted, but I'm sure there was some Zinfandel in there. I like Zinfandel. This is a very interesting twist of fate. They had 10 acres of vineyards, but they also had a lot more acres of plum and walnut trees. The Prohibition hits and destroys almost everything these families have built. Not just these families, but a lot of families in the Napa Valley. And we get out of this Prohibition thing after a decade, and the ramifications are, pretty intense. What's interesting about the Wagner family at this point is they have a fruit business. They still have plum trees. They have walnut trees. And by the 1960s, this is really wild because of all the work that's being done in Napa. Because in the 1960s, in Napa Valley, growing fruit apparently was not a lucrative business. So the Wagners converted their entire property to vineyards. And this is where the modern American wine story sort of begins. You have this couple in Rutherford converting everything to vines. Lorna Bell Gloss, her favorite was Pinot Noir, so they planted Pinot Noir. They planted some, what was called Johannesburg Riesling at the time, which I think is just Riesling. And this is really cool. Charlie gets Cabernet Sauvignon cuttings from a guy named Nathan Fay in the Stag's Leap district, who was friends with Warren Winiarski of Stag's Leap Cellars. Full circle, meta, it's all... And this is the moment. This is where it all happens. This is where, when we talk about Caymus Vineyards, and when you talk to the Wagners, they talk about the conversation that was had in 1972. So this is how it all happens. The Wagners are growing grapes. They start selling their grapes to wineries like Inglenook and Sonoma Vineyards. Inglenook and Sonoma Vineyards are making amazing wine from their grapes. This happens a lot in the history of not only American wine, but also European wine, where wine growers or grape growers realize what they're doing in the vineyards pretty awesome, because the wines that the grapes are selling, the wines that are being made from the grapes they're selling are killing it. So the natural next step would be, why don't we make our own wine? And that's exactly what the Wagners were thinking. Now, in 1972, their son, Chuck, so it goes Charles, Charlie, Chuck, Charlie Wagner, and Lorna Bell Gloss Wagner have a conversation with their son, Chuck, who is working for the family business. Because of the popularity of their wine, they think, and this is the big moment they all talk about when you talk to the Wagners. They're sitting at the kitchen table and they're making a big decision with their family. Do we go all in on a commercial winery? Obviously, the answer was yes. And that is what began Caymus Vineyards. They created a winery and they named it Caymus in a nod not only to Rancho Caymus, but the Wapo people connected to the Yuki people, connected to the Pomo people of the past. So here we are in the 1970s of Napa Valley. In 1976, the Judgment of Paris happens. So everything that was happening up until 1976 in the Napa Valley was a lot of work by a lot of humans making a lot of wine that was really good. And the Wagners were part of this. And I'm starting to get a sense that 1973 was a banner vintage in Napa Valley, because it's the 1973 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay that does better than French wines in the Judgment of Paris. It's the 1973 Stag's Leap Cellars Cabernet Sauvignon that wins. It wasn't really a competition. But that's national right there. That's national. The 1973 vintage of Caymus was also well received, but locally. Caymus's first vintage was in 1972. It makes sense because they were already making wine. They didn't need to get things up and running. So the 1972 vintage comes out 240 cases. And then the 1973 vintage comes out. They're starting to increase their volume. But this is where a local critic named Robert Finnegan falls in love with their wine. Robert Finnegan was a restaurant critic from San Francisco, but he was really enjoying what was going on up north in the wine scene. So he began a newsletter to kind of help San Franciscans enjoy wine. So this is the big moment for Caymus. 1973 vintage, but from a local critic, not a national magazine. But it did the same thing. People fell in love with the wine, they sought it out, and through the 70s and the 80s, they made a bunch of wine. And they increased in volume gradually and steadily. And then in 1989, they found some barrels that were better than other barrels, and they made something called a Caymus Selection, which also did very well. And that's Caymus. Sort of. As of 2015, son Chuck now runs the operations at Caymus. So what is Caymus today? Caymus is a large brand wine. In 2013, they increased their acreage by 178 acres. They now source Cabernet Sauvignon from 8 of the 16 AVAs of Napa. They source some from places that, like Coombsville, that are cooler, and then they source some from the valley floor, I think, for the warmer side of it. And the way they're thinking is they bring both the acidity from the cooler sites and the sun-soaked fruit from the warmer sites, and the result is the Caymus wine. The thing is, at the time Caymus became popular, it was a 240 case wine. That increased over time, but it was still a wine that was able to express the place in which the wine was made. When you're looking at Screaming Eagle and you're looking at, let's say, Harlan, you're talking about wines that are very expensive because they're from a small place in a limited quantity that is trying very hard to express the sense of place. Caymus is not trying to express sense of place. You can find Caymus in any supermarket in America. It's expensive, but there it is. There's a less expensive one now called Bonanza. And the Wagner family has a lot of different wines. If you ever had Belle Gloss Pinot Noir, that's Joe Wagner. And of course, Belle Gloss is named after Lorna Belle Gloss, whose favorite vine happened to be Pinot Noir, which was one of the first vines they planted back in the day in 1941. Really what it comes down to is this. Caymus says it's a Cabernet Sauvignon. When you scale a wine that can be distributed nationwide, you have to make a lot of it. I think in 2013, when they increased their acreage, they actually built a separate facility as well. The company is big and they make a lot of wine. Scaling Pinot Noir is impossible because it just loses everything. But scaling Cabernet Sauvignon at some point loses its Cabernet Sauvignonness. And because of the 75% rule, only 75% in that bottle has to be Cabernet Sauvignon. I'm not sure if they stick to the 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. I'd like to know. But they have to do what they have to do to meet supply and demand. I was blinded on a Caymus once, and I actually thought it was a nice wine. It tasted like a northern Italian red wine, like maybe a blend or maybe a Lagrein or something like that. It was a pleasant wine. It just was not Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon has certain characteristics that let you know what the wine is. And even if you don't know Cabernet Sauvignon, when you taste one that has its inherent characteristics, it's undeniable and goes straight into your memory banks and never leaves. When you have a Caymus, you're basically drinking a kind of elegant red blend. Again, I don't know if it's 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, but that's what Caymus is today. There's nothing wrong with any of that. Caymus is a beautiful, full-bodied red wine from California with deep roots in Napa history. I think that At some point in California, in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, there was this way of making wine. We talked about Heidi Barrett and Screaming Eagle. And in doing my research with that, I realized that this idea of the cult cab is not really what Heidi Barrett made. The cult cab seems to be something that was created outside of it. It seems like something that the cult cab, the big, opulent, high alcohol, dark, whatever, that I think that was built out of the excitement of Screaming Eagle, maybe. I'm not really sure. But during this time, a lot of wines were being made in this way, big, full-bodied, high alcohol, and that sometimes would mask the inherent characteristics of a variety that's the wine's being made from. Also, this is the era of Robert Parker. I cannot stress enough how important Robert Parker was to the American drinking public in the 80s. Again, I'll say this again. The world, well, Europe and the US made wine so that he would like it. He was the marketer. He was the American wine marketer. You got a score from him, you sold wine. So in a capitalist society like the United States, it would make sense to make wine in the vein of what Robert Parker might like. As Robert Parker's influence began to wane and people started moving into different spaces in wine preference, this big, opulent red wine thing is still here. And there is still a preference for the big, opulent red wine. Caymus is not big and opulent, but it does have a sort of character to it that gives a nod to that. There's actually a quote from an article we wrote about Caymus. It says this: "The wine has evolved a riper, more generous profile, keeping pace with a broader stylistic shift that took root in the Napa Valley during the late 1990s. These days, Wagner describes Caymus as, quote, supple, round, dark, rich, tannic, but not bitter, and picked ripe, so the acidity is not in your face in terms of tart." Basically, what that says is that they're making a wine that's softer, more plush, less peppery, but with tannin. So what they're doing is they're making Cabernet Sauvignon wine, or wine based on Cabernet Sauvignon, but they're not allowing the Cabernet Sauvignon to 100% express itself, opting more for a softer, plusher red wine. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the wine. It's expensive and it's everywhere. So to sum it up, Caymus has roots in the history of California, in the history of the Napa Valley, in the history of Northern California, in the history of Missouri wine, and in the history of European wine and the American pioneer story. It also has roots in the kind of Renaissance or the Napa Valley phoenix rising from the ashes of Prohibition. It's a wine in a family that's been around for a long time, and it's kind of amazing. The wine is now everywhere, and it's a little bit expensive, but that's how you wine 101 Caymus.